Between 1949 and the mid-1950s, the CIA launched one of its earliest and most secretive covert operations of the Cold War. Its objective? Penetrate deep into Soviet-controlled Ukraine and help ignite a resistance movement that had already been largely extinguished by Stalin's regime. To do this, the CIA turned not to American operatives, but to Ukrainian émigrés, refugees who had fled war, repression, and Soviet rule. Many had fought with or alongside nationalist movements during World War II. Now they were recruited, trained in espionage and sabotage, and parachuted back into a homeland that no longer recognized them. Each man carried radio equipment, coded orders, and the nearly impossible task of re-establishing contact with the underground nationalist resistance, a network that was, by then, mostly destroyed or deeply compromised. These agents weren't just fighting for intelligence, they were fighting for memory, for identity, for a Ukraine that existed only in exile and fragments. But what awaited them wasn't resistance, it was surveillance. The KGB had already infiltrated many of the networks the CIA hoped to revive. Drop zones were compromised, locals had been interrogated or turned, and in some cases the Soviets let the landings happen only to quietly capture the agents, flip them into double agents, or erase them altogether. Of the 85 agents inserted into Ukraine, over 75% were killed or captured within weeks. No support came, no rescue followed. For many, their final transmission was also their obituary. This was Operation Red Sox, an ambitious and deeply flawed CIA operation that is now remembered less for its objectives and more for its consequences. It revealed just how quickly good intentions can collapse in the face of bad intelligence. It exposed the dangers of romanticizing resistance without understanding the reality on the ground, and it became a quiet scar within the CIA's early Cold War record, a mission wrapped in secrecy, regret, and silence. Today, as Ukraine once again finds itself at the center of global conflict, the lessons of Operation Red Sox are more relevant than ever. It reminds us that in covert warfare, failure isn't just strategic, it's human, and that the cost of getting it wrong can echo across generations. By 1949, the world had split in two, divided not by borders, but by ideology. The Cold War had begun in earnest, with the United States and the Soviet Union locked in a global struggle for influence, dominance, and survival. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was tightening its iron grip across Eastern Europe. One by one, countries behind the Iron Curtain fell into Moscow's orbit: Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and among them, Ukraine, torn from its brief post-World War I independence and forcibly absorbed into the USSR, stood as both a symbol and a battleground. But Ukraine was not quiet. In the hills, forests, and mountain ranges of western Ukraine, a fierce and deeply rooted resistance endured. These were not ordinary rebels. Many were veterans of earlier wars, nationalists hardened by generations of struggle for independence. They were the remnants of the Ukrainian insurgent army, fighters who had battled the Nazis and now turned their fury against the Soviets. Armed, organized, and unrelenting, they refused to surrender. To Washington, this defiance was a spark, an opportunity in the shadows. The CIA, newly formed just 2 years earlier in 1947, was still shaping its identity. Eager to prove its value and roll back the creeping tide of communism, the agency began planning one of its boldest early covert operations. The idea was as simple as it was dangerous: infiltrate Soviet Ukraine. Parachute agents into hostile territory, support and supply the local resistance, undermine Soviet control from within. It was a high-risk gambit, equal parts ideology and intelligence. For the CIA, it was a chance to strike at the Soviet Union's underbelly, to test the limits of covert warfare, and to rewrite the rules of the Cold War. What followed would become one of the agency's earliest and most ambitious operations. It would also become one of its most haunting. The operation was simple in theory: drop trained agents into Soviet territory, rekindle a local resistance, and gather intelligence from within the heart of the enemy's domain. In practice, it was chaos waiting to unfold. Using unmarked planes flying out of clandestine airfields in West Germany and Austria, the CIA launched a secret air bridge into one of the most surveilled and hostile regions in the world, Soviet-controlled Ukraine. The flights often took place under the cover of night, dodging Soviet radar and patrolling fighters, navigating treacherous weather and uncertain terrain. But these weren't typical American operatives parachuting into the Soviet Union. They were Ukrainian émigrés, men with complicated past, many of whom had fought against both Nazi and Soviet forces during World War II. Some had ties to the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. Others had fled westward as the Red Army reclaimed Eastern Europe. They had witnessed atrocities, survived persecution, and carried with them not just skills, but scars. Recruited from displaced persons camps and immigrant communities across Western Europe, they were offered a chance to return home, not as civilians, but as instruments of war. The CIA trained them in espionage, sabotage techniques, cryptography, and clandestine radio communication. Their mission? Make contact with the Ukrainian nationalist underground, assess its strength, deliver supplies, and transmit actionable intelligence back to CIA stations in Europe. They were told they were heroes, warriors of freedom, the vanguard of Western support for a free Ukraine. But the reality on the ground was far more dangerous and far less coordinated. Once dropped into Soviet territory, the agents faced overwhelming odds. Surveillance was ubiquitous. Local informants, fearful or loyal to the regime, were everywhere. The NKVD, precursor to the KGB, had years of experience dismantling underground movements. Entire villages could vanish overnight under suspicion of collaboration. Even worse, many CIA assumptions were based on outdated or overly optimistic intelligence. The underground resistance the agents were sent to contact had been severely weakened, its leadership killed or captured, its networks infiltrated. In some cases, the Soviets had already penetrated the nationalist movement so deeply that the CIA unknowingly delivered their own operatives straight into enemy hands. It was dangerous, it was bold, and it was deeply, tragically flawed. From late 1949 through the mid-1950s, the CIA funneled an estimated 85 operatives into Soviet Ukraine under the banner of Operation Red Sox and its parallel efforts. Each insertion carried the same fragile hope that these men could revive the resistance, report Soviet troop movements, and chip away at the Iron Curtain from the inside. But there was one crucial thing the CIA hadn't fully grasped. Soviet counterintelligence wasn't just vigilant, it was ruthless, methodical, and deeply entrenched. By this time, the NKVD had evolved into the KGB, a formidable security apparatus that combined espionage, psychological warfare, and internal surveillance with terrifying efficiency. They had spent years hunting down remnants of nationalist resistance movements in Ukraine and elsewhere. Their knowledge of local geography, dialects, and insurgent tactics was extensive, and they were watching. Always watching. Unbeknownst to the CIA, many of the planned landing zones were already compromised. Soviet agents had penetrated émigré networks abroad, identifying flight paths, likely drop zones, even the backgrounds of individual operatives. In some cases, the KGB allowed the insertions to proceed, only to capture the agents immediately upon landing. Some were killed outright, others were forced into silence, and a few, through a mix of coercion, torture, or promises of survival, were turned into double agents, used by the KGB to feed false information back to CIA handlers in Europe. Entire networks were built around shadows and deception, while Langley remained unaware that its operation had been fatally pierced from the inside. And then there were those who simply vanished. No final transmission, no last signal, just a broken radio, a snapped parachute line, or a shallow grave in an unmarked forest. By the time the operation was quietly scaled down, roughly 75% of the 85 agents had either been killed or captured, many within mere days or weeks of insertion. The CIA, still in its infancy, had underestimated the sheer reach and capability of its Soviet counterpart. Worse still, the Ukrainian resistance on the ground, so central to the agency's plan, was a shadow of what it had once been. Years of Soviet crackdowns had decimated its leadership. Internal betrayal, forced confessions, and mass deportations had shattered its cohesion. By the early 1950s, what remained was fragmented, hunted, and unable to support the incoming operatives in any meaningful way. Operation Red Sox had become a trap of the CIA's own making, an experiment in Cold War warfare that had cost dozens of lives and exposed the limits of Western influence behind the Iron Curtain. Despite the grim outcome of Operation Red Sox and the staggering human toll, the CIA wasn't done. Failure didn't mean retreat, it meant adaptation. If boots on the ground couldn't win, hearts and minds in Soviet Ukraine, perhaps voices on the airwaves and words on the page could. In 1952, the CIA shifted gears. What emerged was a new initiative, quieter but no less ambitious, Project Aerodynamic, later known by its cryptonym QR-Plum. This was no longer about parachutes and radios buried in the snow, this was about narratives, belief, identity. It was psychological warfare, subtle, strategic, and aimed at the soul of a nation. Rather than infiltrating armed agents, the CIA now poured resources into information warfare. The battlefield was no longer just Ukrainian soil, it was the Ukrainian mind. At the heart of this effort was Radio Free Europe and its sister operation, Radio Liberty. These CIA-funded broadcasters transmitted Ukrainian language programming deep into Soviet territory, using powerful transmitters stationed in Western Europe. The broadcast offered a counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda, news from the outside world, updates on dissident movements, and messages of cultural pride and national identity. The goal wasn't just to inform, it was to inspire. Simultaneously, the CIA worked with émigré organizations and exiled intellectuals to produce anti-Soviet literature, pamphlets, essays, poetry, even underground newspapers. Much of this material was printed in secret across Western Europe and then smuggled into Ukraine through a network of couriers, black market traders, and sympathetic contacts near the Iron Curtain. But perhaps the most cunning tactic of all was the exfiltration and re-infiltration of voices. Dissident Ukrainian writers and intellectuals, those who had fled Soviet rule or been rescued by the West, were given platforms abroad. They published books. They spoke on international stages. Their work was amplified across the diaspora. Then, under CIA guidance, their writings were smuggled back into Ukraine, covertly reintroduced as contraband culture. These were not military strikes, but cultural subversions. Slow-burning fuses lit inside the Soviet Union itself. Every essay, every shortwave broadcast, every poem about Ukrainian identity was a challenge to the Soviet narrative. And it all happened under a veil of total secrecy. QR-Plum became one of the CIA's most enduring Cold War projects targeting Soviet Ukraine. It didn't carry the same immediate risk as Red Sox, but its effects were potentially just as explosive, ideologically, emotionally, and politically. The fight had moved from the forest to the frequency, from rifles to radio waves, and in the Cold War's long shadow, words could be weapons. While QR-Plum successfully sidestepped the fatal pitfalls of Operation Red Sox, its actual impact remained elusive. Information warfare was inherently difficult to quantify. Intelligence officers could track how many broadcasts were aired and how many leaflets were printed, but they couldn't measure how many hearts were moved, how many minds were changed, or whether those seeds of dissent ever truly took root. It may have helped preserve a flicker of Ukrainian nationalism behind the Iron Curtain. It may have inspired isolated acts of resistance or given hope to those trapped in a system built on silence and fear. But it did not achieve the strategic goal the CIA had once dreamed of: a large-scale uprising, a self-sustaining liberation movement, a challenge to Soviet control from within. The empire held firm. Meanwhile, Operation Red Sox, the bold, bloody, and ultimately disastrous campaign of agent insertions, was quietly shelved. There was no official statement, no press release, no public inquiry. The mission simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the outside world. Inside the CIA, however, Red Sox became a grim case study, a textbook example of Cold War overreach. It was dissected behind closed doors in after-action reports and internal reviews. Analysts pointed to flawed assumptions, the belief that an organized resistance still existed in Ukraine, the hope that émigré operatives could safely reconnect with old networks, the expectation that Soviet counterintelligence would be slow or ineffective. Each of those beliefs proved tragically wrong. The CIA had also underestimated the depth of Soviet penetration into immigrant circles abroad. In some cases, even the recruitment process had been compromised. Agents were selected with the help of informants already working for the KGB. Mission plans were known before boots ever hit the ground. And then there was the human cost. For years, the families of the men who volunteered or were recruited for Red Sox received nothing. No updates, no closure. Letters went unanswered. Deaths went unacknowledged. The agents had simply vanished behind the Iron Curtain, swallowed by a silence colder than the war itself. Some families still don't know what happened. They don't know where their sons or brothers died, or even if they were killed at all. The CIA maintained strict operational secrecy, often refusing to declassify even the most basic details. The cost of transparency, they argued, was too high. And the few who did survive, those who escaped capture or managed to exfiltrate themselves after the operation unraveled, were sworn to silence. Under threat of legal repercussions, and sometimes out of loyalty to their fallen comrades, they buried their experiences deep within them. Their stories, when finally told decades later, were filled with disillusionment. Some spoke of feeling betrayed, used by an agency that misunderstood their homeland and underestimated its enemies. Others simply mourned the mission's cost, not in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of friends lost and lives shattered. Operation Red Sox faded from public memory, never officially recognized. Its agents never publicly honored. And yet, in the CIA's long, shadowy history, it remains a defining early lesson that even the most well-intentioned covert action, if built on shaky ground, can collapse into tragedy. Only in the decades after the Cold War did the full story begin to surface, not through headlines or formal apologies, but through whispers. Fragments of truth emerged from declassified documents, redacted reports, and the fading memories of those who lived it. Historians pieced together timelines. Survivors broke decades of silence, and with each revelation, the shadows of Operation Red Sox and Project Aerodynamic became a little clearer. What we now understand is that these weren't just failed espionage missions or footnotes in a long Cold War timeline, they were something far more profound. Early experiments in how the United States would conduct its wars in the gray zone. Wars without front lines, without declarations, without accountability. They were, in essence, trials by fire for the CIA, a new agency thrown into the deep end of global conflict, armed with limited experience and an overwhelming sense of urgency. They represented America's first real attempts to wage ideological warfare across borders, to insert itself into the hearts and histories of nations struggling under the weight of Soviet domination. The intentions, at least in theory, were noble: support freedom, resist totalitarianism, empower the oppressed. But in execution, the reality was murkier. The missions were plagued by poor intelligence, cultural misreadings, and a tragic failure to grasp the complexities of the societies they sought to influence. Operatives were sent into compromised zones. Resistance networks had already been dismantled, and in many cases, the line between support and exploitation was painfully thin. What these operations ultimately reveal is a deep, uncomfortable truth at the core of the Cold War covert strategy. That even the most righteous motivations, when pursued through shadowy means and without an honest understanding of the ground truth, can lead to failure, disillusionment, and irreversible loss. For the CIA, Operation Red Sox remains more than a closed file. It is a scar, invisible to most, but known to all who study the agency's history. It represents a moment when optimism overpowered realism, when geopolitical ambition eclipsed human consequence, when the desire to strike a blow against tyranny led into silence, disappearance, and death instead. And yet, from that silence came lessons, quiet, sobering ones. Lessons about humility in the face of complexity, about the limits of foreign intervention, and about the weight of responsibility when waging war in the shadows. Operation Red Sox began with a promise. It ended in silence. But the echoes remain, a remainder of what happens when noble ideals collide with the hard truths of espionage and empire. Today, as Ukraine once again stands at the epicenter of global conflict, its sovereignty tested, its people under siege, the past feels closer than ever. The names have changed, the battlefields have shifted, but the stakes remain eerily familiar. And in the silence between air raid sirens, in the tension of modern front lines, the ghosts of Operation Red Sox whisper through the decades. They remind us that history is not a straight line, it's a circle. They remind us that freedom is fragile. It is not gifted or guaranteed, but fought for. Often in isolation, often in darkness, often at great personal cost. They remind us that resistance is costly. It's not just measured in military victories or territory gained, but in the lives lost, the families broken, the voices silenced before they could be heard. And most haunting of all, they remind us that secrets, even those wrapped in good intentions, can echo across generations. Hidden operations, buried missions, unnamed heroes, these things don't stay in the past. They shape how nations remember, how they mourn, and how they move forward. Because sometimes the Cold War didn't need mushroom clouds or missile crises to scar the world. Sometimes it only needed a radio transmitter, a parachute drop in the dead of night, and a name that would never appear in any book or memorial. Those men, those missions, and those silences, they're part of Ukraine's story, and part of America's. And as the world watches Ukraine once again fight for its place in history, those Cold War echoes ask a quiet but urgent question. What have we learned? If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.